Hi, general psychology students. If you are in Carrie Stevens' class, let me introduce myself. My name is Mary DeZindelet. I'm one of the other psychology professors in the Department of Psychology, and I've been at Cameron since 1993. My area is social psychology, so I was so happy when Carrie Stevens asked me to do a video to show you, to cover this topic, because I just think it's the most interesting in all of the areas of psychology. If you're in my general psychology class, the purpose of this video is to introduce the chapter 12, social psychology. And so in this video, I'm going to be covering from chapter 12 from the textbook, sections 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3. And if you look at the Unit 4 study guide, in this video, we'll answer what is the fundamental attribution error. We'll talk about the Stanford prison study. We'll talk about cognitive dissonance theory. We'll answer the question to what makes people be more persuasive, and we'll talk about persuasive techniques. So let's begin. I want to begin by defining social psychology. So social psychology is the scientific study of how individuals think, feel, and behave in social situations. Now, for me, it's hard to come up with a situation that isn't social, because even if I'm alone looking in a mirror, by the fact I'm looking in the mirror, I'm looking at myself the way I think people will look at me in the rest of the day. I'm still looking at myself as a social object. So social psychology, the area ends up being very, very broad and wide, because there are so many situations where we're in a social situation. And so studying how we think, feel, and behave in those situations, you could see how that covers a lot of material. So one of the things that your book starts with that I think is a great place to begin with social psychology is we recognize that most of the time we are asking the question after we observe someone do something. We ask them, why did they do that? So a faculty member comes into my office and tells me how the new computer, the XYZ 5000 computer, is just really hard to use and it's horrible. And as a human being, one of the first things I'm going to ask myself is, why is the person saying this? What's going on here? What I'm really asking is, what am I attributing his behavior to? And one of the ways when we go to make our attributions, we call it attribution theory, when we go to make our attributions, when we go to decide why someone is acting the way that they're acting, we really ask ourselves, is the person acting this way because of something to do with them, with their knowledge, their skills, their abilities, their opinions, their traits, something to do with them? If we decide that they're acting this way because of something to do with them, we're going to call that an internal attribution. But sometimes we might decide that the person is acting this way because of something to do with the situation outside of them, and we're going to call that an external attribution. So internal attribution, the person's acting that way because of something to do with them. External attribution, they're acting this way because of something outside of them. Okay, so if I decide that this faculty member that came in and is telling me how hard the XYZ 5000 computer is to use, I might think to myself, every time we get a new computer, he has a hard time with it. And I might ask some of the other faculty, are you having a hard time with the XYZ 5000 computer? And if they all tell me, no, it's been a breeze, it's actually really easy transition, I might say, that faculty member, he's just not very good with computers, or he's not good with change in computers. I'm going to make an internal attribution. However, if I talk to the other faculty and they're all having a hard time with the XYZ 5000 computer, when I think back on how has he responded to other computer changes, and usually he adapts really well and easily and quickly, I might say, wow, this computer must be really hard to use. I'm going to make an external attribution. It's not something to do with him, it's that the computer is really difficult. Does that kind of make sense? So that's internal and external attributions. Now let's look at the PowerPoint slides for this chapter, because I'd like us to start talking about some of the errors that can happen when we make attributions. So if we go to the chapter 12 social psychology PowerPoint slides, the first slide defines social psychology, which we've already done. But the second slide talks about the biggest error that can happen with attributions. We call it the fundamental attribution error. Obviously, anything that's called fundamental, you're really expected to know. And so what the fundamental attribution error says is that most of the time, we are going to underestimate the effect of the situation, and we we are going to overestimate the effect of the person's internal beliefs, knowledge, skills, abilities, opinions, and so on. In other words, we're going to be more likely to make an internal attribution than an external attribution. When that faculty member comes in, I'm going to be biased with the fundamental attribution error to thinking that he's not good with computers rather than blaming the computer. So the fundamental attribution error, and the example here that they're showing is, why was this person late? Is he late because he's an unreliable person? That's an internal attribution. Or is he late because he hit traffic on the way? Something that's outside of his control, external. And what we find is that we're more likely to say, oh, it's because of him. We're more likely to say he's unreliable. We ignore or underestimate the effect of the situation and overestimate the effect of the person. Even knowing the fundamental attribution error, I have a hard time with this. When I was teaching my classes face-to-face last semester, if a student started to nod off in class, I had a hard time not saying, boy, that student isn't that interested in this topic. I'd make an internal attribution rather than saying to myself, I wonder if that mother was up all night with a kid who was crying or a kid who was sick, or maybe that was a student who had to work all night and really hasn't gotten enough sleep. So we're biased toward making an internal attribution rather than an external attribution. That's the fundamental attribution error. Now, there is another attribution error that we call the actor-observer effect. You'll see it in your textbook. And the actor-observer effect says, yes, we're likely to do the fundamental attribution error. We're more likely to make an internal attribution than an external attribution when we're looking at other people's behavior. However, when we're looking at our own behavior, we're more likely to make we're more likely to make an external attribution than an internal attribution. So when we're looking at other people, we make an internal attribution, but when we're looking at our own behavior, we're much more likely to make an external attribution. So oftentimes when I lecture, I pace back and forth, and oftentimes in a regular class when I'm pacing, I might trip a little bit, stumble over the trash can or over a thing in the carpet. So a student watching me is probably going to make an internal attribution and say she's kind of klutzy. But me, because now it's the actor-observer effect, I'm talking about me looking at my own behavior, I'm probably going to say, oh, there's something sticky on my shoe, or there's something weird here on the carpet, or that trash can is in the worst spot. It's way too easy to trip over. I'm going to make an external attribution when I'm trying to explain my clumsy behavior, okay? Another error that we have, a whole group of errors, we call them self-serving biases. And self-serving biases allow us to take credit for our successes and not feel so bad about our failures. So one example of a self-serving bias, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up as a kid, our family used to play Scrabble all the time. And whoever was winning, they always would say that they were winning because, you know, their verbal dexterity was superior to all others. However, when people were losing, rarely did anyone who was losing say, well, I'm just not very good at this game. Instead, they'd say, well, what can you do with a Q and no U? So when you're winning, well, it's because you make an internal attribution. It's because you're just so good at this. But when you're losing, it's a situation. You're going to make an external attribution. I didn't get good letters. And so you can see how that makes us feel good about ourselves and feel good about our accomplishments because they're due to us, and feel less bad about our failures because they're not really due to us. It's due to something in the external situation, you know, an external attribution. So you can see on the slide, it talks about attribution. We talked about internal versus external causes. Oftentimes when people make attributions too, they look to see how stable the causes are. So is this going to happen continually, or how changeable or unstable they are? And then the last thing that sometimes people will look at is how controllable or uncontrollable the causes are. And those three things help us to understand why people are acting the way that they're acting. So one of the one of the big questions that we can ask then are the extent to which the situation ends up affecting our behavior. If we make an external attribution, then we're saying, okay, the situation caused what's going on. But how important are situations? And so there's a very famous Study that I think it's really important that you know about. It's called the Stanford Prison Experiment. And what's Zimbardo is the man who did it, and he was at Stanford University. And Zimbardo was interested in the impact that roles play on people's behavior. So you can think of a role that you're playing as like a situational constraint. And so, like, for example, if you're the hostess at a party, there's a role that you have to play. So all of us know that. So when a hostess comes up to me and says, "Can I get you anything to drink? I'm so glad you're here," I'm probably not going to think, "Oh, she really likes me and she's interested in whether or not I'm thirsty or need food." No, I'm not going to conclude that. That would be an internal attribution. Even though with the fundamental attribution error, we are more likely to make internal attributions, I'm probably going to say she's acting the role of the hostess. And so hostesses ask the people at the party, you know, do they need something to drink or eat, and tell them how happy they are that they're there. So I'm probably going to make an external attribution. So how big of an effect does the situation have on our behavior? So in this prison experiment, Zimbardo gave university students the role of either prisoner or guard, and looked to see the extent to which this role ended up affecting their behavior. And I'd like to show you this video now. Okay. So I'm showing you the Zimbardo prison study.
Grammarly does more than catch errors.
We have to get through the ad first, sorry.
Really good. No. In August of 1971, Professor Philip Zimbardo began an investigation into the power dynamics that exist between guards and inmates in a prison setting. The object of the Stanford Prison Experiment was to determine if it was the acquisition of power that made guards turn brutal, or whether brutality was actually intrinsic to human nature itself. The notorious experiment that ensued would kick off decades of academic controversy and suggest some very dark things about the nature of humanity. Today, we're going to take a look at why the Stanford Prison Experiment...
Now, I'm not sure if I agree with this, but this is a good video describing.
Be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other psychology-related topics you would like to hear about. During the 1970s, both the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps were interested in learning about the hierarchies of power in military prisons. Accordingly, the U.S. Office of Naval Research issued Philip Zimbardo a grant to study the relationships between prison guards and prisoners. The objective would be to determine if those relationships were shaped more by the prison environment or the personalities of the guards. The grant would be used to create a mock prison environment in which to conduct the experiment and to pay the participants. The Stanford Prison Experiment started with an ad Zimbardo placed in the classifieds. It read, "Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life, $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks. 70 people applied. The applicants were interviewed and asked to take personality tests. Anyone who had a criminal record or record of abusing narcotics was eliminated, as was anyone who displayed personality disorders, physical disabilities, or psychological problems. Ultimately, 24 college students, all white and all male, were selected to participate. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into." Zimbardo and his team randomly divided the students into 2 prisoners and guards. There were 12 of each category, 9 that were active participants, and 3 that were alternates. On August 17, 1971, the experiment began when the 9 prisoners were arrested by actual police officers from the Palo Alto Police Department. Each person was taken into custody, then had their mugshots taken before being fingerprinted, blindfolded, and moved into a holding cell. Finally, they were taken into a mock prison that had been set up in the basement of Stanford's Jordan Hall. The fake prison felt very real. The researchers who created it had consulted with prison officials and ex-convicts before designing it. The cells were built in a space that was normally used as a laboratory. Each cell had a barred door. a cell number, and room for 3 prisoners. Other touches included a solitary confinement cell that had been created in a closet, and a rule that prisoners had to be blindfolded before being taken to the bathroom. To avoid selection bias, participants were assigned to be either prisoners or guards based on the results of a coin toss. Very different fates awaited each respective group. Guards were given real prison guard uniforms, complete with nightsticks and whistles. Many guards even donned mirrored sunglasses, which were meant to prevent eye contact with the prisoners, or maybe just to look like Boss Godfrey from Cool Hand Luke. Prisoners, on the other hand, were stripped, deloused, and dressed in sandals and an ill-fitting numbered smock. They weren't issued any underwear, but they were given nylon stocking caps, which they were asked to wear in lieu of having their heads shaved. Once dressed, a chain was placed on each of the legs. Prisoners were only addressed by their number and had to refer to themselves and the other prisoners in the same way. It was a recipe for dehumanization and oppression. Zimbardo himself served as superintendent of the prison, and researcher David Jaffe played the warden. The two were responsible for instructing the guards and laying down the scope of their duties. First and foremost, the guards were told to maintain order. To this end, they were allowed to use any means necessary, short of physical violence. Things that were permitted included harassment, the withholding of food, and the deprivation of privileges at the guards' discretion. The guards, unlike the prisoners, were also allowed to work in shifts. The shifts, which each required 3 guards, lasted 8 hours. Off-duty guards didn't have to be at the prison, but were asked to remain on call in case of an emergency. On the first night, the guards decided to use a whistle to rouse the prisoners from their sleep for a head count at 2:30 a.m. Some of the prisoners didn't take the head count seriously, and the guards punished them by making them do push-ups. After a head count, the prisoners had already had enough and decided to rebel. On what was only the second morning of the experiment, they removed the numbers from their uniforms, pulled off their stocking caps, and barricaded themselves inside their cells using their beds. When the next shift of guards arrived in the morning, they were alarmed to find the prisoners yelling curses at them from their cells. They requested reinforcements and made plans to quell the uprising. They brought in the on-call guards, and the night shift volunteered to do extra duty. It was only day 2, and things were already getting ugly. In order to get the cell doors open, the guards used fire extinguishers to force the prisoners away from the barricades. Once that was accomplished, they rushed into the cell, grabbed the prisoner, and stripped them naked as a jaybird. The birthday suit prisoner was then placed into solitary confinement. While they were there, the guards would remove the bed from their cell, meaning the prisoner would have to sleep on the floor when they returned. Once the rebellion was controlled, the guards had to figure out how to prevent another from happening without having to have all 9 guards perpetually on duty. The solution was to divide and conquer. The guards deemed one of the cells the privileged cell. Well-behaved prisoners were placed in the privileged cell, where they would get their uniforms and beds back, and even get special meals. The other prisoners were not only denied of all these things, but were deprived of their normal food rations. After a few hours, the guards would randomly move the prisoners around. The idea was to create confusion and sow the seeds of distrust among the inmates. And it worked.
I don't know how to get rid of these commercials in here. They don't last long.
In the wake of the uprising, conditions deteriorated fast. The guards started making a point of dehumanizing the prisoners by making them call out their identification numbers. Prisoners were also forbidden from using the bathroom at night and were forced to use a bucket in their cell instead. Soon the guards stopped emptying the buckets, reasoning that the bad smell was simply another punishment for misbehavior. Despite what Zimbardo described as frequent reminders from the staff, the guards grew increasingly aggressive. The most egregious behavior occurred when the staff wasn't paying attention, which became stressful and frustrating for the prisoners. The prisoners, as a result, became increasingly submissive, and the experiment was about to claim its first victim. After only 36 hours, prisoner Doug Corpy began suffering from what was described as acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying, and rage. The guards used this opportunity to try and coax him into becoming a snitch, but when his erratic behavior continued, the staff realized Doug was in genuine distress and needed to be released from the experiment. On the 6th day, Zimbardo convened a mock parole board, which was headed by one of the experiment's prison consultants. Inmates who believed they deserved parole would be allowed to present their case to the board. It was during these presentations that Zimbardo, along with the other researchers, began to theorize that the prisoners no longer saw themselves as participants in an experiment, but as real prisoners. According to Zimbardo, the prisoners had internalized their crimes, as well as their roles as inmates. As for the guards, he came to identify three different types. Tough but fair guards, who followed prison rules. Good guys, who did little favors for the prisoners and never punished them. And finally, guards who appeared to thoroughly enjoy the power they wielded. Zimbardo felt this last group was hostile, arbitrary, and inventive in their forms of prisoner humiliation.
Okay,
Zimbardo
and we're going
concluded
to
that most
stop.
people were
We're going to stop it there. As you can see, the experiment had to actually be stopped. At one point, the prisoners acted as though they were going to have a breakout. And Zimbardo, instead of looking at this as a study and trying to explore, I wonder how this will happen, he was like, we need to have all of the guards, extra guards in to make sure no one breaks out of the prison. And Zimbardo realized that even he was taking on so much the role of being a warden that he had sort of lost perspective. There's a whole movie just about the Zimbardo experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, and I believe the name of it is Stanford Prison Experiment. We showed it at Cameron about 3 years ago when it first came out with a panel discussion, and I think the movie does a pretty good job at talking about or portraying what happened in the study. The only way that the movie is inaccurate is at one point one of the guards slaps or hits a prisoner, and that never happened. But I highly recommend the movie if you have time, maybe after the course is over, or if you have time over the Thanksgiving break. But what this study lets us know is how powerful roles are, how much we will, when we're given a role to play, how much we invest ourselves in that role, become part of that role, and how that's a pretty normal human type thing to do. And so roles very much affect the way that we behave. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about has to do with our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, because obviously the roles and situations that we're in affect our behaviors, but also what affects our behaviors are our attitudes, right? So if I love ice cream, I'm probably going to spend more time and money and have a weight problem because I'm going to spend a lot of time and money eating ice cream, right? A lot of money on ice cream, lots of my time thinking about and eating ice cream. If I have a very positive attitude towards psychology like I do, then I'm going to read a lot of psychology literature and spend a lot of time researching about psychology and hang out with people who like psychology and talk about psychology a lot. So our attitudes, our thoughts and feelings about things also affect our behavior. Yes, the situation does definitely play a role, but also our attitudes play a role in our behavior. And so there's a famous theory called cognitive dissonance theory that was created by Fessinger. And Leon Fessinger really wanted to understand what happens when there's inconsistency between your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And so, for example, let's say I have an attitude, a thought and feeling that I need to be on a diet. Because I weigh more than it's healthy for me to weigh, and with the coronavirus out there, if your BMI is high, it puts you at risk for having really bad effects if you get the disease. So let's say I have an attitude that I need to be on a diet, but I just ate an entire pint of ice cream. According to Fessinger, I'm now going to be in a state of cognitive dissonance because my attitude and my behavior do not match. And in this state of dissonance, he defines dissonance as this unpleasant psychological arousal state. And when we're in this negative psychological state of, I just ate all this ice cream when I'm supposed to be on a diet, when we're in that state, we're motivated to get out of that state. And he comes up with about 4 different ways that we can get out of this state of dissonance. And one that's real easy and simple to do oftentimes if the attitude is not important to us, is just change your attitude. So I would say, you know what, being on a diet isn't that important. If I get the coronavirus, who knows how much a higher BMI is really going to affect it, and I'm happy at this weight, and you know, it's fine. I don't need, my attitude is no longer that I need to be on a diet, so eating the ice cream is fine. I'm no longer in dissonance. Okay. Another thing I can do is change the perception of my behavior and go, yes, I ate a pint of ice cream, but it's not like I ate a whole quart. So yeah, maybe fruit would have been better, but I didn't eat that much ice cream. It was only a pint. And that now you can see I'm out of dissonance. Another thing that I can do is add some additional thoughts that make the attitude and the behavior back into alignment. So I might say, you know what, when you're on a diet, it's really important to eat dairy. And make sure you've got lots of calcium. And there's lots of calcium in ice cream. So eating ice cream, it's a good thing I ate all that ice cream. I got my calcium intake, and that's important when you're on a diet. So you see how I added a new piece of information to get these things to line up. And he also said we can reduce our perceived choice. We can say to ourselves, well, my husband bought me that ice cream to put me in a good mood, and if I didn't eat it, that would that wouldn't be a good wife. A good wife would acknowledge how wonderful it was that he bought that for me and eat it all up. So you can see with cognitive dissonance theory, inconsistency is going to lead to unpleasant psychological tension, and we can get rid of this tension by changing our attitude, changing the perception of our behavior, adding consonant cognitions, or reducing perceived choice. Now your book also adds in here that another thing that we can do is sort of learn from that and say, you know what, I'm just not going to do that behavior again. And that's usually why we have attitudes that we have. So if I have an attitude that I want to be on a diet, I want that attitude to guide my behavior and make it so that I'm less likely to eat the ice cream in the first place, and then I don't have to experience the dissonance at all. So that explains cognitive dissonance theory. Let's go back to the PowerPoint slides for the chapter. Here we go. So cognitive dissonance theory says, as the slide says, psychological discomfort that arises from holding 2 or more inconsistent attitudes, behaviors, or cognitions. Like, I'm a smoker, but smoking is bad and it leads to cancer. So what are you going to do? So you can either change your attitude and say, smoking's not that bad. Well, that's going to be pretty hard to do. Or you can now change your behavior, stop smoking, change your perception of the behavior. Well, I don't smoke that much. You could add new information to make it line up. That's probably going to be pretty hard with this one. Reduce perceived choice. Well, I've been doing this my whole life and there's nothing I can do to change it now. Okay, so this is cognitive dissonance theory. Let's now switch topics just a little bit. So with cognitive dissonance theory, we're talking about how our attitudes end up affecting our behavior. But let's now talk about attitude change. And another term for attitude change is persuasion. People are trying to get us to change our attitude all the time. Advertisers are trying to get us to change our attitude about their product, to have a positive attitude, and then for that to affect our behavior, specifically we buy their product. And so there's been a lot of research on persuasion, the process of changing our attitude towards something. And one huge whole group of people that did this research was all done at Yale University. So it's now called the Yale approach. And the Yale approach, after decades, like it's over 15 years of research, identified 3 different characteristics that ends up affecting persuasion. And the first one has to do with the source. The person who's doing the persuading is going to actually affect whether or not you get persuaded. And there's 2 main characteristics. One is how credible the source is. So the more credible the source, the more persuasive the source will be. And the other thing is how attractive the source is. So like, are they popular? Are they a celebrity? Are they physically attractive? Do we like them? That kind of thing is going to also make it more likely for us to be persuaded. Now, you might be asking the question, I know I did when I was sitting where you were, well, which is more important, credibility or likability, attractiveness, that kind of thing? Which is more important? And the answer to that question based on the Yale approach is it depends on the topic. So if there is a known, true, correct answer, it's objective, then credibility is going to be more important than likability or attractiveness. However, if it's something like which diet drink tastes the best, it's a subjective, there's not a true known accurate answer, then the attractive or likable person, the attractive person is going to be more persuasive than the credible person. So credibility is more important when there's a known true answer, and likability or attractiveness is more important when there's not. The other thing is that it the other thing that is important here is the message itself, not the source, that's the person who's giving the message, but the second thing is the characteristic of the message. And when you're at Cameron University taking our, Communication 1113 class and your Comp 1 class and part of your Comp 2 class, and if you end up taking more psychology classes, a bunch of the psychology classes, we're going to spend a lot of time training you to become really good message givers, where your messages are highly logical and they're consistent and they're strong and very persuasive. We spend a lot of time doing that. The Yale approach finds, however, that there are other things besides just message strength and how logical the message is that ends up being important. And so the book touches on a couple of these, but I think the main thing that you know is just that there are characteristics of the message that are important. So I'll just give you one example quickly. A message that you have to be more actively involved in is going to be more persuasive than one that's more passive. A message that gives lots of information in it, lots of reasons why it's good, is going to be more persuasive than one that only gives one reason of why doing a particular thing is a good idea. Okay. And then the last thing that the Yale approach found is important are the characteristics of the audience, or on this slide it says the characteristics of the target. And so we find that people who are more distracted, or there's actually an optimal level of distraction. If you're highly distracted or not distracted at all, then you're probably unlikely to be persuaded. But if you're mildly distracted, that's going to be the perfect amount of distraction to make it where you'll be easily persuaded by the person giving you the message. Another thing that's important with the audience is if the audience person knows that you're trying to distract them. So if you are forewarned of the persuasion attempt, then you're much less likely to get persuaded. That's one of the reasons why it is so hard for advertisers to actually change your mind, because change your attitude towards something, because once you know it's an ad, sort of like your walls go up and you're less likely to be persuaded. Other characteristics that are on the slide are that low intelligence people are persuaded more easily, those with weaker beliefs are persuaded more easily, and those that are younger are persuaded more easily. So the Yale approach is going to basically say that persuasion is going to be dependent upon how credible or likable the source person is, different variables about the message, and some variables about the audience members or the target. There's a model called the elaboration likelihood model that was devised to help us really understand the importance of persuasive messages. And I think it's an interesting model that you can read about in the book. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at maryd@cameron.edu or call me at 580-581-2517, and I can answer your questions about the elaboration likelihood model. Just so you know, I think the model is fascinating and really interesting. It is not covered on the test. It's not on the study guide, but I'm willing to talk about it with you anytime you want. Okay, then the last thing I want to talk about here are some persuasion techniques. And so these are some what we call two-step strategies that can lead to persuasion. And I found, for me, when I was sitting where you were sitting, the first time I learned about these, then it seemed for the next weekend, I saw people doing these to me all over the place, and I had never noticed it before. So the first of the two-step persuasion techniques is called foot in the door. And with the foot in the door, what the person is going to do is ask you for a small thing, something that you're likely to say yes to. And then after you say yes and do it, then they ask you for what they really want. So let's say I'm with the United Way and I want people to donate money to the United Way. And I want them to donate $50. Well, that's a lot of money. And so if I just go out and ask people, will you give me $50? Will you donate $50 to the United Way? I may not get very many people to agree. But if I use the foot in the door technique, what I might say is, would you mind putting this bumper sticker saying, I love the United Way on your car and driving around for the next couple of weeks with this bumper sticker on your car? Or I might ask, if it's a student, would you put this sticker on one of your notebooks? And as you're walking around campus, this is sort of pre-COVID times, walking around campus, if you'll have this sticker on a notebook that says, I support the United Way, or I love the United Way. And let's say, I'm probably going to get quite a few people who will say, sure, I'll do that. Then a couple weeks later, I can say to them, okay, thank you so much for going around with the sticker saying how you support the United Way. Would you be willing to make a donation for $50? And by using this foot in the door technique, statistically significantly more people are going to then give me the donation of the $50 after they've done this smaller request of, for free, put a sticker on their notebook or on their car. After they've done that, they're more likely to comply and use this foot in the door agree to give me the $50 if I use the foot in the door technique. And what we think is going on with the foot in the door is this commitment and consistency. That once you agree to say, oh yeah, I'll put a sticker on my car, then you sort of see yourself as, I'm the type of person that, helps the United Way. So now when I'm asked to actually give them money, in order to be consistent with that, I'm going to need to give them the money. Another way to do it, another two-step strategy, is door in the face. And this is almost the exact opposite of foot in the door. So with door in the face, you ask a huge request, one that the people are going to say no to. After they say no, then you ask them for what you really want, the target request. So what I might do here, well, actually, Cialdini, one of the researchers who created the door in the face phenomenon, or named it that, what he did is he asked some people, would you take a group of juveniles to the Phoenix Zoo for 2 hours this Saturday and show them around? And he got some people to say yes, but not that many. So that was his target request. That's what he really wanted. With other people, he used door in the face. And when he used the door in the face, he said, would you be willing to volunteer 2 hours a week, every week for the next 2 years with a group of juveniles to help them improve? Everyone said no. And then he'd say, okay, well, if you won't do that, would you be willing to take a group of them to the zoo this Saturday for 2 hours? And what he found is over 50% of the people said sure. So when we use door in the face, the underlying thing that's going on here is called the norm of reciprocity. This norm that we have that we reciprocate things. So when I ask you a big thing and you say no, and then I reduce what I'm asking for, I expect now you to reciprocate by being willing to do more. And so when we use door in the face, we're sort of using this norm of reciprocity against the person, because you didn't really want them to do it for 2 hours every week for 2 years anyway. You just wanted them to take them just for the Saturday for 2 hours. But you seem to ask less, so then they're willing to do more. So that's the door in the face. Then we've got that's not all. So you tell someone what it is. I see this all the time in the ads. So they'll say, don't you think it's reasonable for you to spend this much money on this product? But if you're willing to do so, not only will I give you this product, I'll also give you this, and you'll get this, and we'll throw in this for free. And so that's called the "that's not all" effect, and or strategy. And we find that people are much more likely to say yes if these freebies are thrown in, these extra incentives, even when the extra incentives are things that we don't want or care about. It works though. And then not so free sample, this is when we offer a free sample beforehand, and how much this will oftentimes increase sales. So if someone gives you something and then starts talking to you, it's going to be much harder for you not to, it's going to be harder for you to say no to their request, because again, this norm of reciprocity, they began by giving you something, so now you sort of feel like you owe them something. They handed you a cookie before you started talking, now you sort of feel like you need to say yes. And so these two-step strategies have really been found to be useful in getting people to do what you want them to do, to be persuaded to act the way that you want them to act. And that's it for this video. There's going to be another video that's going to talk about the rest of the chapter and the rest of the study guide questions.